Welcome to dark history for sleep. Tonight we walk into a city that has stopped breathing. It is the year 1348, and the Black Death has swept across Europe like a tide of shadows. Merchants whisper of entire towns vanishing overnight. Priests bury their congregations in pits too wide to bless. And in the narrow streets of Florence you can smell the sickness before you see it. The air is heavy with smoke from burning pitch, a desperate attempt to cleanse what no one can see. Doors are marked with crude symbols to warn others away. Inside, entire families lie still, some gone, some almost gone. And from the end of the street, a figure approaches. He wears a long, dark robe of heavy waxed cloth. His gloves are thick, his boots sealed tight. Over his face, a mask shaped like a bird's head, its curved beak stuffed with dried herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges. Glass lenses hide his eyes. In one hand, he carries a thin wooden cane, used to point, prod, and keep distance from the living and the dead alike. But this is a plague doctor, to some, a savior, to others, a walking omen. And in truth, he is both. The title, Plague Doctor, carries the weight of medical authority. But in reality, many who wore the beaked mask had little or no formal training in medicine at all. In the chaos of an outbreak, cities were desperate. When the plague arrived, wealthy physicians often fled, escaping to their country estates, leaving the sick behind. Those who stayed could command enormous fees, and many refused to treat the poorest citizens. This left a void, and into that void stepped the plague doctors. Some were young medical students seeking experience. Some were retired barbers or surgeons with only the basics of anatomy. Others were simply men willing to risk their lives for a wage. They were hired by city councils, given contracts that promised payment for each month they served, if they lived long enough to collect it. They were not expected to cure the sick. Their duties were more grim, recording deaths, examining bodies to confirm the plague, and keeping the sick quarantined away from the healthy. They were the city's eyes in the streets of death, its record keepers in a time when entire neighborhoods could vanish in days. This work required more than medical skill. It required a certain resignation, a willingness to walk into rooms no one else dared enter, and to keep walking, day after day, even as the infection crept closer. The mask of the plague doctor is one of history's most unsettling images. A pale, bird-like face with hollow glass eyes, its curved beak jutting forward like the skull of a carrion crow. Its design was born in 17th century France, credited to physician Charles de Lorme. He believed that disease spread through miasma, poisonous, foul-smelling air that seeped from the sick and the dead. If one could block the miasma, perhaps one could block the plague. The beak was more than decoration. It was a filter packed with aromatic herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloth. Rose petals, camphor, lavender, and cloves were common choices, not because they killed the disease, but because they masked the stench of death. The mask's long nose also created distance, forcing people to stand back when speaking. In the crowded, panicked streets of plague cities, this space was as valuable as armor. But the appearance itself carried power. The mask turned the plague doctor into something inhuman, a faceless figure that could walk among the dying without flinching. For the sick, it was a sign that help, or judgment, had arrived. For the healthy, it was a warning to keep away. The beaked mask was only part of the plague doctor's armor. Every inch of skin had to be hidden, every seam sealed against the invisible enemy that filled the air. The robe was made of heavy linen or canvas, coated in wax or animal fat to repel bodily fluids. It hung loose to allow movement, but its folds trapped heat, turning the inside into a suffocating cocoon during summer outbreaks. Gloves of supple leather covered the hands. Boots of the same material reached to the knee. A wide-brimmed hat, black and stiff, announced the wearer's status as a physician. The hat was as much a symbol as the mask, a signal to guards and city officials that this figure had authority to pass freely through quarantined zones. In one hand, the plague doctor carried a cane or staff. This was not for walking. It was for pointing to patients without touching them, lifting bed sheets to examine bodies, and at times keeping desperate citizens at bay. Dressed like this, the plague doctor became a sealed vessel, moving through a city that reeked of death, protected only by the hope that layers of cloth and herbs could hold back the Black Death's reach. The plague doctor's day began before the city stirred. Dawn was the safest time to move through the streets. When the air was cool, the sun low, and most of the sick were still silent in their homes. He followed a route mapped by the city council, visiting neighborhoods where the plague had struck hardest. The alleys were narrow, the gutters clogged with refuse. Windows stayed shut, but behind them the sounds of coughing and fevered murmurs seeped into the street. At each marked door, the cane would rap against the wood. If no one answered, the doctor would push it open, stepping inside to find the truth, whether the family still clung to life or if the house had already gone silent. His work was not only to tend to the sick, but to count them. He carried a ledger, writing down the number of infected and dead in each home. It was cold work, but without such records, the city could not track the plague's spread, or measure how quickly it was swallowing its people. The doctor rarely lingered in one place. He moved quickly, for every breath was a risk, and the streets themselves felt cursed. The air inside the sick room was heavy, thick with the smell of sweat, sickness, and smoke from smoldering herbs. Windows were often nailed shut, in the belief that sealing the house would keep the plague from creeping in or out. The doctor moved carefully, his cane sweeping bedding aside to reveal the patient beneath. The signs were almost always the same: fever-bright eyes, skin flushed or pale, and the telltale swellings, buboes, in the groin, armpits, or neck. These could grow to the size of an egg, darkening until they split and oozed. In some cases, the patient was already too far gone to speak. The doctor would take their pulse, make a note in his ledger, and move on. For those still conscious, he might prescribe bleeding, purging, or the application of poultices, treatments born from medieval medicine, often as dangerous as the disease itself. The family, if still alive, would watch from the shadows. Some begged for help, offering coins, food, or jewelry. Others avoided his gaze entirely, afraid that the plague doctor's visit was as much a death sentence as the sickness itself. When the examination was done, he would mark the door to warn others. Sometimes it was a painted cross, sometimes a strip of cloth, but the meaning was always the same: plague within. By mid-morning, the doctor's work had shifted. The living were fewer now, and most doors opened not to cries for help, but to silence and stillness. Right inside, the bodies lay as they had fallen. Some curled at their beds, others collapsed in the middle of the room, caught by death in the act of trying to rise. The plague could take a healthy man in less than 3 days, often sooner. The doctor's cane was used to turn the bodies, checking for the telltale blackened patches on the skin, a sign of septicemia when the blood itself had become poisoned. Each death was recorded with meticulous care: name, age, occupation, address. Sometimes there was no name to write, only unknown. In times of plague, strangers died far from home, their bodies claimed by the city rather than family. Outside, the dead wagons rolled slowly through the streets, their wheels crunching over broken tiles and debris. The drivers did not speak. Their work was the final chapter of the doctor's visit, to take what could no longer be saved and carry it to the pits beyond the walls. Leaving the sick district was never simple. The city kept strict boundaries between the infected and the safe quarters, though in truth, the disease cared little for walls or checkpoints. At the edge of the zone, guards stood with halberds crossed, blocking entry and exit. The doctor showed his council-issued pass, a wax seal stamped on parchment. Without it, no one was permitted through. Those who tried to sneak out were met with brutal punishment: beatings, imprisonment, or in some cities, execution. The fear was that even a single flea, hidden in the folds of a cloak, could carry the plague into untouched streets. Beyond the barricade, life continued in eerie contrast. Markets bustled, children played in the squares, and taverns poured ale into mugs as if the shadow of death were not just a few streets away. But the doctor knew better. He had seen the plague leap across districts before, carried by travelers, merchants, even rats aboard river barges. The safe streets were living on borrowed time, and their turn would come soon enough. By the time the doctor returned to his quarters, the sun was low and the air heavy with the scent of smoke and decay. The most important part of the day began now: the cleansing. First, the gloves came off. They were scrubbed in a basin of vinegar, then hung in the open air to dry. The boots followed, their soles scraped clean of the filth from the streets. The robe was wiped down with cloths soaked in aromatic oils: rosemary, sage, juniper, chosen for their supposed power to repel the plague's invisible vapors. In some cities, the entire suit would be fumigated, held over smoldering herbs until the waxed fabric steamed. The mask was treated with the greatest care. The herbs in the beak were replaced daily, and the glass lenses polished until they shone. For all its eerie appearance, the mask was the doctor's most trusted companion, his barrier against the unseen. And yet, no amount of cleaning could erase the truth. Many plague doctors fell ill despite these precautions. Some never made it past their first month. Others lasted a season before their names, too, were entered into the city's death ledger. To wear the mask was to accept a burden few could carry. Every knock at a door, every step into a sick room, was a gamble with death. The doctor's contract said he was to treat all citizens, rich or poor, young or old. But in the filth-choked alleys where poverty lived, the plague was a fiercer beast. Here, whole families slept in a single room, sharing the same air, the same fleas, the same fate. Many doctors faced a cruel choice: linger with the hopeless and risk infection, or move quickly on, offering only the barest of care. Some justified it as pragmatism, saving themselves to help those who might survive. Others saw it for what it was: self-preservation, wrapped in the language of duty. Not all were so cautious. There are records of plague doctors who stayed for hours with the dying, holding their hands through the fever, comforting children too weak to stand. These men rarely lived long, and when they died, their replacements often learned from their example to keep the visits short, the mask in place, and the heart guarded. To the city's leaders, the plague doctor was a symbol of control, proof that someone was fighting the disease. But to the people in the streets, the sight of that beaked mask often meant something else entirely. Death was near. Children would hide behind doorways when the long shadow passed. Superstitions grew, whispering that the mask did not protect from disease at all, but was instead the face of the plague itself, a creature in human form, marking homes for the grave. Some swore that to look directly into the glass eyes of the mask was to invite the sickness into your own body. Others believed the doctors carried curses in their canes, tapping doors and walls to spread the illness rather than cure it. Even those who knew better could not escape the unease. The doctor's voice was muffled, filtered through cloth and leather. No smile, no expression, only a faceless bird-like head turning slowly in your direction. It was a cruel irony that the man risking his life to help others would be greeted not with thanks, but with suspicion and fear. When the plague took hold of a household, it rarely claimed everyone at once. Some clung stubbornly to life, even as death moved through the rooms. The doctor's orders were clear: separate the sick from the well. It was one of the few measures the city believed could slow the spread. But in cramped homes where families shared a single bed, such separation was nearly impossible. The cane would tap the floor, pointing to those who must be moved. Sometimes it meant carrying a feverish child to a neighbor's house or relocating an uninfected spouse to a hastily converted barn. Other times, it meant something far harder, leaving the healthy locked inside with the dying, because there was nowhere else to send them. These decisions were swift, but their weight lingered. The doctor knew that in saving one, he might be condemning another. Yet hesitation was dangerous. Every moment spent in a plague house was another moment for the invisible enemy to find a way through the seams of his suit. And so the separations were made, the doors shut, and the streets marked anew with the silent tally of the plague's reach. As the weeks passed, the burial grounds swelled like the buboes the doctor saw each morning. Churchyards overflowed, and fresh graves crept into fields, gardens, and the edges of the city walls. The doctor often walked beside the dead wagons, not to mourn, but to ensure the bodies were recorded. Even in death, the city wanted order, names written down, numbers tallied, causes noted. But there came a point when the records faltered. The bodies arrived too fast, too many in a single day to track with ink and parchment. They were lowered into pits wide enough to swallow a street, lime thrown over them to mask the stench. The earth was filled and flattened, erasing any sign of the hundreds, sometimes thousands, buried below. These plague pits would remain hidden for centuries, their dead forgotten until the earth was disturbed by new construction or the dig of a workman's shovel. Even then, the bones told the story, a generation swallowed by a sickness that knew no boundaries. The doctor stood at the edge of these pits, watching the soil swallow the last of the day's dead. Some of them had been alive when he visited that morning. By dusk, they were gone. The plague was not only a sickness of the body, it was a sickness of politics. In times of crisis, city councils scrambled to control both the disease and the people's fear. Plague doctors were caught in the middle. They were hired by the government, paid to keep records, and sometimes ordered to underreport deaths to avoid panic or protect trade. A city known to be dying would lose its merchants, its travelers, and with them, its lifeblood. Some officials demanded the doctor focus only on wealthy districts, where influential families could demand daily visits. The poorer quarters were left to rot, their dead counted in silence. And then there was the issue of payment. Many doctors signed contracts promising generous wages, but as the death toll rose, so did the city's expenses. Some doctors finished their service only to be refused the gold they'd been promised. Their families left to beg, their work dismissed as a public duty. The politics turned the mask into more than protection. It was a uniform of obedience, a reminder that the plague doctor's loyalty was not only to the sick, but to the ones who ruled over them. When death ruled the streets, morality bent under its weight. The plague doctor was sworn to serve the city, but survival sometimes demanded quiet bargains with fate. There were days when he was called to a home, far from his assigned district. A wealthy merchant might offer a pouch of gold to examine his family first, before the doctor continued to the alleys where the poor waited. Turning down such an offer was rare, not because the doctor was greedy, but because the extra coin might feed his own family or pay for better herbs in the mask. There were darker trades, too. In some places, the doctor was expected to list property left behind by the dead, ensuring it went to the city or its chosen heirs. It was an open secret that a few coins or valuables might disappear before the list was sealed. And then there was the question of truth. If the doctor reported a household as plague-free, the family could escape quarantine. But they might also carry death with them. In desperate times, such decisions were made in moments, the consequences left for tomorrow. But these choices did not make the plague doctor evil, but human, caught between duty, desperation, and the unrelenting shadow that hung over every street. The mask was heavy, not just in weight, but in what it carried. Well, every morning, the doctor put it on, knowing it might be the last day he drew breath. Every evening he took it off with the smell of death still clinging to his skin. Weeks blurred together. The faces of the dead crowded the mind, and sleep brought no rest. Only dreams of swollen limbs, labored breathing, and the sound of cartwheels creaking through empty streets. Some doctors drank heavily to dull the visions. Others grew numb, moving from house to house as if in a trance. A few broke entirely, casting off the mask and fleeing the city in the dead of night, their names cursed by the council, but forgotten by the living. Those who stayed learned to live with the silence that followed them. Neighbors avoided them, friends kept their distance, and even family members refused their touch. To be a plague doctor was to walk among the living as a ghost, a reminder of the thin line between life and the pit. Not every door opened to despair. There were rare, almost miraculous moments when the doctor found life winning against the plague. In one such house, a young mother lay pale but breathing steadily. Her fever had broken overnight, her pulse slow but strong. The swelling in her neck had stopped growing, a fragile sign that her body was fighting back. The family wept at the sight of the doctor, not out of fear, but gratitude. They pressed bread into his hands, bowed deeply, and spoke blessings for his safety. It was moments like these that reminded him why he endured the stifling heat of the robe, the weight of the mask, and the unending parade of death. These recoveries were few, but they carried power. The doctor could leave a house like this, feeling lighter, as if, for a single day, he had stolen something back from the plague. Still, he knew such victories were rare and fleeting. By the next morning, he might be marking a new cross on their door. The plague was not only fought in the streets and sick rooms, it was battled in the realm of belief. In an age before germs were understood, the soul was thought to be as much at risk as the body. Priests walked alongside plague doctors, offering last rites in whispered Latin. For some, the appearance of both men at the same door meant the end was certain. But religion also set boundaries on what the doctor could do. Certain treatments were frowned upon if they conflicted with scripture or local customs. In some towns, attempts at autopsy were forbidden, lest the body be defiled before burial. This kept the doctor from learning what truly killed his patients, and kept the plague's mysteries hidden longer. Superstition was an even greater obstacle. Families burned herbs not for their medicinal value, but to drive away evil spirits. Some refused treatment entirely, believing the sickness was God's will and that survival would be a sign of divine favor. The doctor learned to navigate this fragile balance, speaking carefully, avoiding conflict with the church, and quietly using whatever methods he believed might work when no one was watching. There came a point when the plague did not just claim lives, it emptied cities. The streets once filled with vendors, horse carts, and the shouts of children became echo chambers. Shops were shuttered, markets abandoned, and the only footsteps were those of the plague doctor and the men pushing the death carts. At night, the silence was deeper still. No music from taverns, no church bells for weddings, only the tolling for funerals, so frequent that the sound became background noise. In some cities, the population was cut in half in a matter of months. Entire neighborhoods were walled off and left to rot, their residents trapped inside with their dead. The doctor's visits grew longer, as he was now one of the few people moving freely between districts. There was an eerie sense of ownership in this emptiness. He could walk through the richest square and hear nothing but his own breath behind the mask. But it was a hollow dominion, a kingdom of the dead that would soon claim him too, if the fates decided so. The end came not with a single moment, but with a slow, suffocating crawl. In the final days of a plague's peak, there were few calls for help. Most who could cry out were already dead. The doctor's work shifted from tending the sick to documenting the collapse. Fires burned in the streets, set by desperate citizens to cleanse the air. The smoke mixed with the stench of rot, turning every breath into a labor. Houses stood with doors open, not from welcome, but because there was no one left to close them. Inside, meals half-eaten lay on tables, tools rusted in place, children's toys scattered on floors. It was in these moments that the doctor felt most exposed. Without the living to watch him, he wandered through ghost streets alone. Every creak of timber, every rustle in the shadows, a reminder that the plague was not the only danger. Thieves, desperate for food or gold, still stalked the ruins. Soon the city's gates would close entirely, not to keep people out, but to keep the sickness in until it burned itself away. And when they opened again, what remained would be unrecognizable. When the sickness finally loosened its grip, it did not leave peace behind, only absence. The survivors emerged cautiously, as if expecting the air itself to bite them. Shops reopened with new owners. Farms were tilled by unfamiliar hands. The faces on the streets had changed. Whole families gone, replaced by strangers from neighboring towns. The doctor's work shifted once more. Now he was called to confirm deaths from starvation, malnutrition, and lingering fevers that struck the weakened. The plague might have ended, but its shadow still fell over every home. There were questions no one could answer. Had it been divine punishment? A curse? Would it return in a year? Or 10? The uncertainty kept fear alive, and in that fear, the plague doctor's mask still carried power. Or some wanted him to stay on as a guardian against future outbreaks. Others wanted him gone, fearing he carried the sickness in his very breath. In the end, the doctor was left to walk away, alone, his services no longer wanted, until the next time death called him back. When the doctor finally stepped back through his own door, the silence was different. Here, it was not the quiet of a dying street, but the stillness of isolation. Most plague doctors lived apart from their families, either by choice or by decree. The risk of bringing sickness home was too great. Some kept small rooms above apothecaries or near the city gates, places easy to leave at the first sign of trouble. If he did have a family, contact was rare and cautious. Children might only see their father from across a courtyard, speaking through windows, never touching his hands. Meals were taken alone, clothing burned or boiled after each day's work. Even in his own bed, the mask seemed to linger, its weight still on his face, its scent of vinegar and herbs in his nostrils. Dreams came in fragments, the tap of his cane, the glassy eyes of the mask staring back at him from a darkened room. This was the life beyond the streets, a half-existence in which the doctor was never truly part of the living, but not yet claimed by the dead. In times of disaster, people search for someone to blame, and when the plague raged on despite all efforts, the doctor's mask made him an easy target. Rumors spread that plague doctors were not healers, but spreaders, paid to carry the disease from house to house, to keep fear alive and coffers full. Some claimed the herbs in their beaks were not for protection, but for poisoning. In certain towns, angry mobs confronted doctors in the streets. The same cane once used to keep distance now became a weapon in self-defense. More than one doctor was beaten, stripped of his mask, and driven from the city he served. The accusations were rarely investigated. Fear was a faster judge than any court, and so a man who had risked everything to slow the plague could find himself fleeing for his life. A healer turned pariah, his name cursed by those he had once tried to save. The mask, once a shield, could become a death sentence in the wrong street at the wrong hour. It happened not with a dramatic tear in the suit, but with something far smaller. A loosened strap, a hurried movement, a moment of carelessness after years of vigilance. The doctor had been tending to a young patient, barely able to lift her head from the bed. In the cramped room, his mask brushed against a low beam. The leather strap at his temple gave way, and before he could catch it, the mask slipped from his face. The air was thick and sour, hot with the breath of the sick. He pulled the mask back on quickly, but the moment had already passed. He knew it in the pit of his stomach. The exposure had happened. There was no panic, only a strange stillness. After years of guarding against the invisible, he finally felt its presence settle on him. He finished his rounds, wrote his records, and walked home through streets he had memorized in every season of death. In the quiet of his room, he removed the mask slowly, knowing it might never be needed again. It began as it had for so many others, a heaviness in the limbs, a dull ache behind the eyes. By the second day, the fever rose like a tide. Sweat pooled beneath his clothes, and the world tilted when he tried to stand. He had seen this pattern 1,000 times in others, and he knew what came next. The swellings appeared along his neck and under his arms. They were tender to the touch, hot and angry beneath the skin. He traced them with trembling fingers, the same way he had examined countless patients before. This time, there was no clinical detachment, only the grim knowledge of what they meant. The other doctors avoided him. Even those who had once called him colleague now visited only briefly, standing far from his bed. He understood. He had done the same. But from his cot, he could hear the carts in the street and the calls for the dead to be collected. Soon he knew they would come for him. The fever burned through the night, pulling him in and out of waking dreams, faces blurred in the candlelight, patients he'd tried to save, streets he'd walked alone, the silent rows of graves. He could no longer drink without help. His hands shook, and each breath came with a dull, wet rattle deep in his chest. The mask sat on a chair by the bed, its glass eyes staring at him in the gloom like a silent witness to his undoing. He thought of the early days, when he believed the mask and robe would be enough, when he thought the work was a service, not a sentence. By dawn, his voice was gone. The swellings had grown hard and black, and his skin felt like it no longer belonged to him. The world narrowed to the rhythm of his breathing, and then even that rhythm began to break apart. When they found him, he was still in his bed, one hand resting on the mask, as if to take it with him. There was no ceremony. The death of a plague doctor was recorded like any other, a name in a ledger, a brief note of cause. 2 men from the death cart came at first light. They did not remove his robe or gloves. Those were burned on the floor beside the bed. The mask, once a shield, was tossed into the fire as well, its leather curling and cracking in the heat. His body was wrapped in a waxed shroud to keep the fluids from seeping through, then carried to the plague pit outside the city walls. He was lowered in among strangers, patients he may have visited, children he may have examined, faces he had once leaned over through the beak of his mask. The earth closed over him without a marker. The city could not spare the stone or the time. Within days, another doctor would take his place, pulling on a new mask, walking the same streets, making the same silent bargain with death. In the end, the plague did not care if a man wore the robe or the rags. It claimed them both, and the city moved on. Centuries later, the plague doctor would be remembered not for his name or deeds, but for the mask. The long beak, the dark robe, the glassy inhuman eyes, these became symbols in paintings, in woodcuts, and in whispered stories told by candlelight. To some, the figure was a hero, braving the breath of the dying to save others. To others, he was a specter, a bringer of death whose appearance meant the end was near. Over time, the truth blurred. Few remembered that most plague doctors were poorly trained, their treatments crude, their contracts written more to protect the city's wealth than its people. What endured was the image, a faceless sentinel moving through a world undone by disease. In modern festivals and costume balls, the mask is worn for spectacle, its terror softened into theater. But for those who lived through the plague, the sight of that beak in the street was enough to make the heart sink and the shutters close. Behind the mask, the plague doctor's tools were a strange mix of medicine and myth. He carried a cane to lift blankets and point to rashes, minimizing touch. Pouches of herbs, lavender, mint, rosemary, were stuffed in the beak, not because they killed disease, but because people believed bad smells carried sickness. Sweet air, it was thought, would keep death away. Treatments were as varied as they were desperate. Lancing the swollen buboes to drain corrupted blood was common, though it often hastened the patient's end. Bloodletting, cupping, and applying heated coins to the skin were all believed to draw out the poison. Some remedies came from older traditions. Powders made from crushed gemstones, ointments of vinegar and rose water, or drinking potions laced with mercury, a cure deadlier than the disease. To a modern eye, these methods seem cruel, even absurd. But in the doctor's time, they were weapons in a war against an invisible enemy. And sometimes, belief alone was enough to give a patient a few more days. Most plague doctors left no record. They arrived in a city, served their term, and vanished into death or obscurity. But a few wrote, and what they left behind was as grim as the work itself. In their journals, they described streets lined with bodies, the sound of cartwheels over cobblestones, slick with rain and blood. They wrote of knocking on doors and finding whole families in their beds, dead for days. One doctor, in a letter to a friend, spoke of the constant dread that he would wake with a fever and have no one to tend to him. Another wrote that the eyes behind the mask were never truly his own, that after months of wearing it, he felt more like the mask than the man. These writings were not meant for the public. They were confessions, unloading the weight that the black robe forced them to carry in silence. Centuries later, historians would read them and realize how little separated the healer from the dying he served. Plague doctors were not saints. For most, the work was not a calling. It was a contract. The cities hired them when the plague appeared, offering wages that tempted the desperate or the ambitious. Some were young physicians hoping to make a name. Others were older, in debt, or unable to find other work. Payment could be generous: coin, food, even housing during the outbreak. But the contract often came with clauses. The doctor could not leave until the plague was over, no matter the risk. If he died, his family might receive nothing. In some cases, doctors negotiated payment in goods, fine clothing, barrels of wine, or even land in the countryside. These rewards came at a cost, and every man who signed the agreement knew it. Some served well and earned their pay. Others used the position for profit, extorting families for extra visits or charging bribes to declare a home plague-free. The mask and robe gave them authority, and in desperate times, authority could be abused as easily as it could save. By the 18th century, the figure of the beaked plague doctor began to fade from the streets. Advances in medicine, better sanitation, quarantine systems, and a growing understanding of disease made the old methods obsolete. The mask's herbal beak and heavy robe were relics of a time when fear was the only real defense. New physicians wore simpler clothing, and their work was supported by hospitals instead of makeshift wards. The last great outbreaks of plague in Europe saw fewer and fewer of the black-robed figures. By the time the 19th century arrived, the plague doctor was more a memory than a profession. But the image did not die. In art and folklore, he lingered, a reminder of the darkness that had once walked openly in the daylight. For some, the beak was a symbol of courage. For others, it was the shadow of death itself. And though the role had vanished, the lessons of those years remained. Lessons written not in books, but in the graves that stretched beyond the city walls. The beaked mask has outlived the men who wore it. Today it walks in parades, appears in theater, and stares from the windows of costume shops. But beneath the novelty, it still carries an echo of fear. In art, it has become a symbol of pestilence, a shorthand for invisible threats that creep through a city. During modern pandemics, the image has resurfaced in graffiti and protest signs, a reminder that disease still humbles even the most advanced nations. Some embrace the mask as a curiosity, a piece of history to be worn with a smile. Others find it unnerving. The blank glass eyes, the long beak, the suggestion that death itself might be walking toward you. The irony is that the mask never truly worked. It could not stop the plague. It was a barrier of leather and superstition, and yet centuries later, it endures as one of the most recognizable symbols in medical history. The streets are empty. The shutters are closed. Only the wind moves through the alleys, carrying with it the smell of ash and sickness. A lone figure in black walks between the houses, his cane tapping against the stones. There are no calls for help now, no doors left ajar. The plague has taken what it came for. He passes the market square, where once he saw mothers bargaining for bread and merchants calling their prices. Now the stalls are overturned, the cobblestones stained dark where blood and rain have mixed. The mask feels heavier with each step, not from its weight, but from the knowledge that the city he serves is already lost. Still he walks, because the contract demands it, and because the role leaves no room for retreat. At the edge of the city, he stops. The walls stretch behind him, silent and cursed. He turns once, then disappears into the fog, his figure swallowed like a shadow at dusk. History does not remember their names. It remembers the beak. Most plague doctors were not great physicians, and many were never meant to be. They were contracts in human form, paid to stand between the living and the dead when no one else would. Their legacy is not in miraculous cures, but in the willingness, or perhaps the desperation, to face a threat no one understood. In this way, they were both guardians and relics of a medical world still ruled by superstition. The stories told about them today swing between admiration and horror. Some call them heroes who walked into hell. Others see them as omens, symbols that death was already at your door. But perhaps their true legacy lies in the quiet truth that humanity will always find someone to send forward when the rest of the crowd steps back, whether that person returns or not. The plague doctor was never just a man. The moment he pulled the mask over his face, he became something else. A boundary between life and death, hope and despair. But the beak hid his expression. The robe erased his shape. To the sick, he was a figure from another world, one that might deliver salvation or simply mark the end. Centuries later, the truth is still tangled at the folds of that black cloth. Was he a savior, a profiteer, a symbol of courage, or a warning carved in leather and glass? Perhaps he was all of these, and perhaps that is why the image endures. Because the plague doctor stands for the uneasy truth that in the face of death, we cling to whatever shape hope takes, even if it comes wearing a mask that smells of herbs and fear.